I've got two readings for you this morning. The first is an excerpt from the Reverend James Ford's God is One, Francis David, Reformation Unitarianism, and some of its possible significance for contemporary UUs, which was a blog post from 2013. He writes, together with learning of Transylvanian Unitarians, we have discovered one of the most compelling spiritual figures, frankly, of world religion. Here we are presented with a fierce intellect and questing spirit, a religious leader and a social rebel within my opinion, more substance, certainly more intellectual and spiritual rigor than either Calvin or Luther or any of the rest of that Reformation gang. We have found, thanks to these connections with Hungarian-speaking Unitarians, not just a distant cousin of whom we can be proud, but an exemplar, a pointer of the way, a teacher and guide on our own way. We have discovered Francis David, and with him we get a cast of characters and a story that more truly than most is our story. Francis David was born in the beginning of the 16th century in Kolosovar, today Cluj, in the kingdom or principality of Transylvania. Kingdom from the perspective of the Transylvanians themselves, principality in fact that they were within the thrall of the Ottoman Empire. His father was a shoemaker, but his mother came from Hungarian nobility, and so he had social access. His intellectual capabilities were recognized early on, and patrons supported his education, even sending him to Wittenberg for 4 years for advanced studies, after which he was ordained a Catholic priest. He sounds like such a good UU already, right? We've all made this journey. Spiritually restless and intellectually rigorous, he chafed at the strictures of the Catholic faith, eventually converting to Lutheranism. He quickly was elected the Lutheran bishop for Transylvania. Under the influence of George Biandrada, physician to the king and a significant spiritual intellect in his own right, David continued to wrestle with his faith and eventually declared for the more rationalist Calvinism, then quickly becoming a Calvinist bishop of Transylvania. The evolution of his faith continued. He and Dr. Biandrada found themselves deeply influenced by the Spanish anti-Trinitarian Michael Servetus and the great Dutch humanist philosopher Erasmus. Among the problems for David was the lack of any scriptural clarity around the nature of the Holy Spirit, and with that, the whole idea of God being described as a Trinity. In the meantime, Dr. Biandrada arranged for his friend to be appointed court preacher. His command of the scriptures, his eloquence both in pulpit and in debate, and with his ability to speak with equal elegance in Hungarian, German, and Latin, it appears no one was able to meet him head to head in disputation. And significantly, gradually, actually not gradually, Francis David's preaching and eloquence became more and more obviously anti-Trinitarian. These questions and disputes gradually spread beyond the court. It may be hard in our time and place to understand how powerful and compelling these questions were, or the physical danger that accompanied questioning such bedrock assumptions, an area that neither Luther nor Calvin ever dared go. Reverend Ford continues with some information about the Edict of Toleration, the Edict of Torda, notes that there were mysterious circumstances around King John's death, and that he was succeeded by a Catholic. Persecution began then, while David's thinking continued to evolve. Biandrada was afraid for their new church and joined with others to denounce David, who was tried and convicted of heresy. He died in prison shortly thereafter. And the second reading comes from UU World's The Edict of Torda, a landmark in religious freedom by Reverend Eric Cherry. There is so much that the Edict of Torda points to that our tradition continues to rely upon. The grounding commitment that faith is not endowed with purpose by governments or empires, but by the sacred, the holy. That a free pulpit and a free pew are necessities for free religious communities. Even the stirrings of our commitment to resist authoritarianism as a religious practice is signaled in the edict. This anniversary is an opportunity to look back, to remember foundations and commitments that can be touchstones for the faithful struggle ahead. The Edict of Torda is one of those reliable sources of power and inspiration. There is no need to romanticize history, though. It is clear to 21st century UUs that the Edict of Torda did not go far enough, but it was an important step on a pathway to reform and freedom that continues today. Radical in its time, he was martyred for his steadfast commitment to the work of unending reformation. David's particular commitment provides inspiration, not a destination in our own. Beyond these matters of faith and practice, the anniversary of the Edict of Torda, which was celebrated in 2018, calls American Unitarian Universalists to know themselves better by celebrating the history of the world's first Unitarian churches. Our international partners in Transylvania, Hungary, and around the world understand the edict as their moment of birth and establishment, as a basic part of their spiritual DNA. Let us take this anniversary as a chance to understand our partners and our history more completely, to celebrate the radical reform spirit that is at the basis of the Edict of Torda, and to translate that spirit into lives and ministries of purpose today. The 16th century was a wild time for religion in Europe. In 1517, we've got Martin Luther, the German teacher and monk, accidentally setting off the Protestant Reformation when he famously nailed his 95 Theses, the disputation on the power of indulgences, to the door of a church in Wittenberg. While some of these theses he proposed were controversial to church teachings, others were simply an attempt to call the church back into its own values. Specifically, Luther took great issue with the too common practice of selling indulgences. When people sinned and conveyed this to a priest in this era, they were given the option of paying for full or partial forgiveness of their sins. That is, people could pay a fee to reduce or cancel their penance. Some of this was to support wars that the church had initiated, such as the Crusades, to support other church needs. And of course, there were priests or higher ups who were lining their own pockets. What was worse was that this practice of selling indulgences, the fees to reduce or cancel penance, had evolved into a related practice, that of buying indulgences for loved ones who were presumably in purgatory, to release them from their church-mandated penance in the afterlife. Now, Catholic clergy were offended by Luther's accusations, and this began an unraveling of the Catholic Church's hold. Luther himself continued to evolve in his thinking from his initial critiques, realizing that salvation is free and requires nothing, least of all money, to get it. While the criticism of indulgences and some of the theology related to them were within the church's doctrine and practice, the underlying theology that guided Luther is why he was later excommunicated. His understanding of salvation was radical, and related to it was the belief that there needed to be no intermediary between the people and God, a role that the church had long assumed for itself. Luther's challenges to the Catholic Church on the matter of indulgences set off a series of challenges about practices and theology, from questioning infant baptisms to the Holy Communion to Henry VIII's choice to create a new church when the Pope did not grant him an annulment for the first of his marriages. So this is what was happening in Europe in the decades leading up to the Edict of Torda, which was signed in 1568. By that time, Catholicism was still popular, but now it also had to contend with Calvinism, Lutheranism, and other denominations to seat their pews and fill their coffers. And not surprisingly, as new faiths emerged and were establishing themselves, there was a lot of fighting and politicking and trying to claim territory. And did I mention fighting? Both over theological and spiritual matters, as well as physical ones. It's like when you've got a sibling who's pretty similar to you, but different enough, and you bicker all the time, like all the time, and your parents are like, stop. And of course, this was happening. All these denominations were basically less than 50 years old at this point in time and figuring out who they were and who they wanted to be. So this set the stage for the Edict of Torda. Well, it's part of the stage for the Edict of Torda. Another piece of the stage is what the Reverend Dr. Susan Ritchie noticed when she thought about the geography, the history, and the fact that empire also mattered. Ritchie realized that all of what I shared about these religions was part of the story, but something still tugged at a corner of her mind, like a good historian. Ritchie writes about Transylvanian Unitarianism and the context of the edict in her book, Children of the Same God, the historical relationship between Unitarianism, Judaism, and Islam. And I expected to fully nerd out in this sermon, so I have maps. And you can see, I mean, things pretty much look the way that they look at the map today. The Holy Roman Empire is basically Germany and Austria. But you can see in that like slanted blue part above the Ottoman Empire down there, that in that area is where Transylvania is. So you can see like there's the Ottoman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, and then the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and then further east is Russia. And so like everybody's fighting all the time, and it's a mess because it's Europe. So what Ritchie realized, and had been rather overlooked by those who had told the story of how the edict came to be, is that Transylvania was part of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire existed from 1299 until 1918. It was dismantled at the end of World War I. Like other large empires, the Ottomans granted varying degrees of autonomy to their subject nations. And if we could look at the second map too, please. So the second map will show you the extent of the Ottoman Empire, because that last map was very Europe focused. And you'll notice there that it's very concentrated along the coasts, but does extend up into Europe. Okay. So throughout the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire was fighting with neighbors as they also sought to expand. In 1566, the empire reached its peak size geographically. Now remember, the Edict of Torda signed in 1568, and the Ottoman Empire has reached its peak in 1566. There was no mass effort to forcibly convert people to Islam or Christianity, as there had been in other parts of Europe. Spain is a prime example of that, but it happened elsewhere too, thinking about the Spanish Inquisition. For example, the capital of the Ottoman Empire was, for most of its history, Istanbul, or Constantinople. There's a song about that might be in your head now. The former center of Christianity for the Orthodox. The Ottomans took Constantinople and renamed it more than 100 years before the Edict of Torda. And while there was some effort at Islamicizing it, most people were largely left in peace to practice their faiths, whether it was Christian of whatever variety, Jewish or Muslim. It is entirely possible that all this was more about the Ottoman approach to governance than it was about anything else. Like the Romans, who largely allowed people to do their own thing in the places that they lived, the Ottomans also did. So Christianity, Judaism, and Islam coexisted under the Ottoman Empire, as it was in Transylvania. And the three faiths coexisting matters not only for the Edict of Torda, but also the way Unitarianism evolved in Transylvania. As Ritchie writes, the grounds for religious toleration affirmed by the Edict of Torda were prepared by the everyday lives of actual people who were already living in a multi-religious way. It was common for interreligious marriages to take place and for families to then be multi-religious. One example that she gives is of a family where the boys were raised under one religion and the girls were raised under the other of their parents' religions. There was even a small group of Jews in Transylvania called Zeke Jews who had been Unitarians and had adopted Jewish practices as an extension of their Protestant convictions. I'm not entirely sure how that works, but as Ritchie writes, they represent the only instance of an entire community adopting Judaism without historic or genealogical ties to the tradition. The Unitarian and Jewish connection unfortunately reinforced both anti-Unitarian and anti-Jewish persecution. All of this was possible in part because Transylvania was kind of a geographical borderland, surrounded by various Christianities, Judaism sprinkled throughout, and Islam as another neighbor, and the religion of those in power. Because of its geography not being central in Europe or the centers of strong religious identity like the Vatican in Rome or Calvin's Geneva or Luther's Germany, Transylvania was a place where people of different backgrounds came together and where progressivism was welcomed. Ritchie notes, positioned on the doctrinal border of Christianity, Unitarianism often found that its nearest theological kin were not Christian. Unitarian identity in Europe emerged as a defense of the inherent kinship between Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. Thus, Unitarianism was multicultural and multi-religious from its beginning. Michael Servetus was one of our theological ancestors who was executed by order of John Calvin in 1553, so a little bit before the edict was issued. But his work influenced some in Transylvania and many elsewhere. He argued against the Trinity, a wildly and decidedly unpopular argument in that era of Europe, partly because the Trinity is an offensive doctrine to Jews and Muslims. The idea of the Trinity actually separates Christians from their Abrahamic faith siblings. A generation of theologians followed Servetus' thinking, though, including Giorgio Biandrata, a court physician who had considerable influence over Francis David, to whom the words, "We need not think alike, but to love alike," are attributed, although he never said them. Biandrata was interested in creating an intentional Unitarian church from the various anti-Trinitarian theologies around. Imagine, there wasn't even just one, there were like a whole bunch of them. So Biandrata and David both influenced the young King John, as did his mother, Queen Isabella, who was also influenced by them. As noted in the Whistle Stop, she was raised well by her parents with a mind for fairness and humanism, as in the teachings of the Greeks and humans, not as humanism as we're thinking about religiously. To whatever degree, it would help the budding Unitarian movement in Transylvania that they shared the same one God as the Muslims of the Ottoman Empire, as well as that of Jews. Monotheism gave subjects access to protection and legal rights in the empire. They had to pay a tax, but in return, they were treated more or less just as Muslim subjects. Stephen Prothero, in his book, God is Not One, refers to Christianity as a soft monotheism, in that there is a belief in one God, but multiple manifestations of them. This is considered idolatry or blasphemy according to traditional Jewish and Muslim beliefs. This was kind of the point that the Council of Nicaea in 325, that's a sermon for another day, was meant to set Christianity apart from Judaism. So Unitarianism in this setting was perceived as distinct from other forms of Christianity. Toleration then, Ritchie notes, derived from Ottoman policy, Ottoman bureaucratic structure, and Ottoman interpretation of Islam, which was in most instances stunningly liberal, cosmopolitan, and pluralistic. Truth be told, Islam was in some ways a more progressive ally than other Christian sects, not only because of their mutual toleration and enmeshment, but also because Islam had no need to fight as Christian sects were already doing with each other. What Ritchie learned in her research is that the connection between Unitarians and Muslims has been both overlooked and equally deleted. There's the long-time strict division of West and East that has been fabricated, but also the strict separation of Christianity and Islam. In addition, Hungarian church historians have vehemently denied a relationship existing between the two religions. Turkey and Hungary have historically been enemies, and it has been hard for them to think of the Ottomans, who are Turks, as something other than just violent and oppressive. While today we can look at this history and intermixing to be beautiful and rich, at the time it was not experienced that way by many Europeans. They were afraid of the Ottomans and Islam because people fear what they don't know or understand. The Ottomans had been expanding their empire into Europe, and this was cause for deep concern. And because of the Unitarian interest in and engagement with Muslims, they were perceived as a potential threat by extension. We got to be threats from everybody for every reason. Our European siblings in faith have been around long before our own Unitarianism emerged in the US in the late 1700s, but for the most part, we really didn't have a relationship with them until the 1990s, when the UUA's Partner Church program was launched. The Partner Church program was a collaboration that matched mostly American congregations with others in Transylvania and later around the world. The impact of our Transylvanian siblings in faith have had on our American faith in these last decades is important. They have helped us understand ourselves in new ways with new possibilities. Instead of focusing on just not being Trinitarian because it's not scripturally founded, Transylvanian Unitarianism invites us to consider not being Trinitarian because it distances us from our Abrahamic faith siblings that we have historically shared scripturally. Pluralism has a rich legacy in our US American Unitarian Universalist heritage that I'll get into a little bit more next time, but our European siblings have brought us so much, and they have brought us deep conversations with Judaism and Islam that we didn't have otherwise. They have also given us heroes that are our own, as well as long, difficult, honorable history of resistance and community that offer us instruction for these challenging times we now find ourselves in. It is worth remembering that the gifts of the Edict of Torda that gave to Transylvania and Europe, but also worth remembering the lessons and stories of how it came to be. How we live our lives matters. How we celebrate diversity, theological evolution, living our values, and honoring both the past and the future. We are remembering and practicing the best of our faith.